Most people encounter St. George, Utah through a windshield.
Right.
It's just that blast of oven-hot heat when you stop for gas on the way to Zion National Park. Or maybe to you, it's just the place where your grandparents moved to play golf in January. It really feels like this standard, almost manufactured retirement oasis.
Which is incredibly ironic because if you actually look at the geology of the area, St. George shouldn't be an oasis at all. It is a massive geological collision zone.
Yeah.
When you're standing there, you are looking at the convergence of three massively distinct provinces. You've got the Mojave Desert, the Great Basin, and the Colorado Plateau all crashing together.
Right. So it's not just, a generic desert. It's three completely different types of hostile environments converging. You've got the extreme heat of the Mojave, the really weird drainage issues of the plateau, and then the total isolation of the basin. It is, by definition, a crucible for human resilience.
Exactly. And that geological tension, that's really the engine of the whole story we're exploring today. We are doing a deep dive into a comprehensive study on the historical evolution and the cultural adaptation of the Virgin River Basin.
Which is a fascinating set of sources.
It really is. And the through line of all this research isn't just that people settled here, it's that this specific landscape, this literal red rock oven, forced every single group of humans over the last 2,000 years to come up with absolutely radical adaptations just to survive. They were constantly defying environmental constraints.
And I am so excited to get into this because the historical details in this deep dive are just wild. We're talking about ancient hydroengineering, we're talking about a theological attempt to grow cotton in the desert, and honestly, my personal favorite part of the source material, using a literal decommissioned cannon to build a temple foundation.
Oh, and don't forget the state-sponsored wine industry run by strict teetotalers.
Oh, we are definitely getting to the wine. But let's start with the deep history, the land itself. Because long before the golf courses or Interstate 15, this was the territory of the Virgin River Anasazi, or the ancestral Puebloans. And based on the archaeological record we have, they weren't just passing through.
No, they were really digging in. We're looking at a period stretching from roughly 200 BC all the way to 1200 AD. Now, in most desert environments that are this harsh, you would absolutely expect a hunter-gatherer model.
Right. Keep moving. Follow the resources.
Exactly. But the Anasazi in this specific region were highly sophisticated sedentary engineers. They built these things called room block sites. These were permanent masonry structures that physically anchored them to the land.
But the obvious problem there is to stay put in a desert, you need reliable water. And the Virgin River is pretty much the opposite of reliable. It's a volatile flash flood river.
That is the critical constraint of this entire region. To give you some context, the Virgin River drops about 70 feet per mile. Yeah, compare that to the Mississippi River, which drops about 4 inches per mile. So when it rains in St. George, the Virgin doesn't just slowly rise, it tears through those canyons like a buzzsaw.
So the Anasazi adaptation wasn't just basic farming, it had to be intense risk management.
Exactly.
The sources outline how they developed these complex flood irrigation systems for their maize, beans, and squash. And these systems had to be robust enough to catch the scarce water, but somehow resilient enough not to be completely obliterated by the flash floods.
Precisely. They were walking a continuous tightrope between starvation and total devastation. And the amazing part is, they managed to do it for over 1,000 years. You can still see the visual and cultural legacy of their permanence in the petroglyphs out on Anasazi Ridge or along the Tempe Puyallup Trail.
Yeah, I was looking at the notes on those petroglyphs. It's fascinating because the research suggests they aren't just abstract art. They functioned as territory markers or ceremonial records.
Right. Unlike the more nomadic, transient markings you might see elsewhere, these often indicate very clear boundaries. It's essentially them saying, we are here and this is ours. But the great mystery, of course, is that this highly adapted system eventually broke.
Right around 1200 AD, they just vanished from the area.
What archaeologists call the Great Departure. The leading theory in the study is a convergence of factors. There was likely environmental degradation. They might have salinated their own soil with centuries of irrigation, and that combined with a severe mega drought and potential social conflict.
The margin for error was just so thin.
Exactly. In that landscape, once the balance tipped even a little, the civilization just couldn't hold on.
But the basin didn't stay empty, and this is where the historical contrast gets really interesting for us. The Southern Paiute, also known as the Nuuvi, arrive around 1100 AD, and they take a completely different approach to survival.
Yes. If the Anasazi strategy was to try and modify the volatile environment to suit them, the Paiute strategy was to modify themselves to suit the environment. They practiced what anthropologists call seasonal transhumance.
Which is basically vertical commuting, right?
Essentially, yes. In the winter, they hunkered down in the low-elevation river valleys where the climate is much warmer. Then, in the extreme heat of the summer, they moved up into the high mountain forests of the surrounding plateaus. It is a brilliant, low-impact adaptation to the intense thermodynamics of the region.
And it wasn't just a matter of where they lived, it was how they sourced their food. The research specifically refers to it as a dual economy.
That's a really key concept to understand here. They did farm. They grew corn and melons down in the irrigated river valleys, but they didn't rely on agriculture exclusively. They balanced their farming with fording for pine nuts and seeds in the mountains.
So it's an anti-fragile system.
Completely. If your river crops got washed out by a sudden flood, you still had the mountain resources. If the pine nut harvest was thin up high, you had the irrigated corn down low. They also maintained autonomous familial bands that would gather for large social and cultural events, like the bear dance, which kept their society cohesive but flexible.
It really sounds like a perfectly sustainable equilibrium.
Okay.
But then, of course, we hit the massive disruption. And I think this is a part of the history that often gets glossed over. We usually hear this narrative about Mormon pioneers arriving in a completely empty, pristine desert wilderness. But the Paiute society they encountered had already been entirely shattered.
Decimated is probably the better word, and this is crucial for understanding the geopolitical landscape the Mormon settlers actually walked into. The disruption starts with the Dominguez Escalante expedition in 1776, but the real structural damage to the Paiute way of life came with the Old Spanish Trail in the early 1800s.
Because this wasn't just a route for trade wagons passing through. This trail became a major corridor for the slave trade.
It was horrific. You had equestrian tribes like the Utes and Navajos who had recently acquired horses and guns from the Spanish. They used that military advantage to constantly raid the more stationary Paiute communities. They were capturing women and children, specifically to sell in the slave markets of New Mexico and California.
So the Paiutes are being violently attacked from the outside, and simultaneously their environment and food sources are being destroyed.
Right. You had fur trappers like Jedediah Smith coming through and just clearing out the beaver populations.
Which ruins the water table.
Exactly. And then you add the immigrant livestock coming through on the trails, completely stripping the fragile desert grasslands. So by the time the Mormon settlers actually started arriving in the 1850s and 60s, the Paiute population had totally crashed. Their social structure was in chaos. The open land the pioneers thought they found was actually a post-apocalyptic landscape for the people who actually lived there.
Which perfectly sets the stage for what's known as the Call. We're at 1861. The American Civil War breaks out back east, and suddenly, this remote, harsh desert basin becomes strategically vital to a group of religious exiles up in Salt Lake City.
This is a fascinating moment where theology directly meets geopolitics. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, was completely obsessed with the idea of autarky.
Total self-sufficiency.
Right. He wanted territorial expansion specifically to secure water sources and ensure the Mormon territory wouldn't be dependent on the United States government or outside markets for absolutely anything.
And the one critical thing they couldn't grow in the cold climate of northern Utah was cotton.
Exactly. So when the Civil War kicks off and completely cuts off the cotton supply from the American South, Young sees an opportunity, or rather a strict necessity. He decided he needed his own Dixie.
But the Cotton Mission wasn't a suggestion for these settlers. It was effectively a draft.
Literally. During a general conference in October 1861, church leaders stood up and just write out a list of 309 families. If your name was called, you were packing up and moving to the southern desert.
No questions asked.
None. And they didn't just pick names out of a hat. They specifically targeted families who had converted from the American South because those people knew the agronomy of southern crops. They knew how to grow cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane.
Hence the nickname Dixie permanently sticking to the St. George region. It was a literal cultural transplant. But the reality of farming in St. George versus farming in, say, Georgia or Alabama must have been an absolute shock.
A brutal shock. The soil in Utah's Dixie was highly alkaline, the water was volatile, as we discussed, and the summer heat was just oppressive. And because they were struggling so hard to grow cash crops instead of food, malnutrition became a massive issue. Which brings us to the famous story of the Potato Saint.
Yes, George A. Smith, the actual namesake of the city of St. George.
The very same. The early settlers were suffering terribly from scurvy. Their teeth were loosening, their gums were bleeding, they were exhausted. Smith realized they desperately needed vitamin C, but obviously they didn't have access to citrus in the desert.
So he went on this massive public crusade, urging everyone in the settlements to eat raw, unpeeled potatoes,
And not just raw, but often soaked in vinegar.
which sounds like an absolute punishment to eat.
It does. But it was a desperate, brilliant public health intervention.
Mhm.
The skins of the raw potatoes provided just enough vitamin C to keep people alive.
That is amazing. And speaking of keeping people alive, we should mention Jacob Hamblin here. He was vital to this early survival phase.
Definitely. Hamblin had established the Santa Clara Indian Mission slightly earlier in 1854, and he's credited with the very first successful experiment of actually growing cotton in the region. He managed to get 1 quart of cotton seed to yield 30 yards of cloth.
Which proved the concept, even if barely. And that sets the tone for this whole era of radical, uncomfortable adaptation. Because despite the scurvy, the heat, and the isolation, they were absolutely determined to build an industrial economy in the dirt.
The era of industrial experiments. This is where the story shifts heavily into economics. To process all this new cotton, they built the Washington Cotton Factory in 1866. It was this massive stone mill, which is actually still standing today.
And they were successfully producing cloth?
They were. But this whole endeavor is a perfect historical lesson in the economic concept of comparative advantage, or in their case, the total lack of it. Could they physically grow cotton in the desert? Yes. But could they do it efficiently or cheaply? Absolutely not.
And the clock was ticking on their isolation.
Exactly. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and that was the immediate death knell for the Cotton Mission's underlying logic.
Because suddenly you could just import high-quality, mass-produced cotton from the post-war South for a fraction of the cost of growing it in the arid West. The railroad connected them to the broader world, but it totally destroyed their local monopoly.
But the settlers didn't stop swinging. They pivoted. Which brings us to the wine. The wine mission is fascinating because it feels like a massive contradiction in terms for a religious group that is now famous worldwide for abstaining from alcohol.
It really highlights the sheer pragmatism of the time. The sources note that in 1862, they specifically called 30 Swiss families, along with experts like a man named Daniel Bonelli, to settle in the area explicitly to establish a wine industry.
Right, and the stated goal was threefold. They needed wine for the church sacrament, they needed it for medicinal purposes, and they wanted to sell it to the Gentiles, meaning the non-Mormon miners, over in places like Silver Reef and neighboring Nevada.
And we are not talking about a small hobby vineyard here. The scale was surprisingly massive.
Huge. At its absolute peak, the tithing office in St. George was collecting over 7,000 gallons of wine annually.
That is a very significant amount of sacrament.
It really is. But the industry eventually failed for 2 main reasons. First, the quality was apparently notoriously bad and inconsistent. Historical accounts often describe the St. George wine as heavy and heady.
So, not exactly fine dining.
Not at all. But more importantly, theology eventually won out over the economics. As the broader church began moving towards strict prohibition policies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, running a church-sponsored winery became socially and doctrinally untenable.
So they completely discontinued it by 1892, and the local silk industry suffered a very similar fate during this time.
Yes, they planted all these mulberry trees, which you can still see around downtown St. George today, to feed silkworms. But it was incredibly labor-intensive, and they simply couldn't compete with cheaper Asian silk imports.
So it's the exact same story as the cotton. High labor costs, a harsh environment, and global competition crushing the local industry. The economic experiments themselves largely failed.
Yet the settlement itself didn't fail. The people stayed. But to stay, they had to conquer 2 massive recurring villains, disease and the river.
Let's talk about the disease part because it's wild. We typically think of the desert as this very dry, sterile, healthy environment. But early St. George was absolutely plagued by what they called chills and fever, which was malaria.
Malaria in the Utah desert. It sounds impossible, but the crude irrigation ditches they dug and the slow-moving, seeping springs around the valley created perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes.
And it just decimated the pioneer workforce.
It did. The physical toll on these people was immense. There's a specific anecdote in the research about a woman named Nellie Unthank that really encapsulates the stout-hearted nature of these pioneers.
Yes, she didn't suffer from malaria, but her story is incredible. She came across the plains as a child with the Martin Handcart Company. That was the group that famously got trapped in the severe Wyoming snowstorms. And because of that, she lost both of her feet to frostbite.
Right. And yet she didn't just survive that trauma. She eventually moved to St. George and raised a large family there. She moved around on her knees for the rest of her life. When the texts talk about resilience in this region, it is not an abstract concept.
It's literally Nellie Unthank raising children on her knees in 110-degree heat.
Exactly. And while individuals like Nellie were building families, the community as a whole was trying to build civic permanence. They needed infrastructure that proved they were there to stay. Which brings us to the civic buildings.
Starting with the St. George Tabernacle, they built this beautiful New England-style building out of local red sandstone. It even features a clock manufactured by Thwaites and Reed, the exact same makers who built London's Big Ben.
But the real crowning achievement of their permanence was the St. George Temple. It was actually the first temple completed in Utah, finishing even before the massive one up in Salt Lake City.
But the site Brigham Young chose for it was a total geological nightmare. It was this swampy, boggy ground near the river.
And this is the engineering story you mentioned earlier. You cannot build a massive, heavy sandstone structure on a bog. The foundation will just sink. So they had to pound volcanic rock deep into the mud to create a stable base.
But they don't have steam engines or modern pile drivers, so how do they do it?
They use a cannon.
A literal cannon.
Yes, they took an old cannon, reportedly a decommissioned artillery piece from the Mexican-American War, and they filled it with lead to make it incredibly heavy. Then they rigged it up to a horse-drawn pulley system, hoisted it high in the air, and dropped it.
Over and over.
Thousands of times. They used this lead-filled cannon as a makeshift pile driver to repeatedly smash tons of volcanic rock deep into the marsh until the foundation was finally solid enough to build on.
It is the most literal example of beating swords into plowshares. Or, I guess, cannons into temples.
And the aesthetic choices they made once it was built are just as fascinating. They took all this beautiful local red sandstone and covered it completely in bright white plaster.
Right. They deliberately covered up the natural stone?
Because if you stand back and look at it in the valley, you have the towering red cliffs, the deep blue sky, and then this stark, blindingly white building right in the middle. It was a massive architectural statement. It visually said, "We have conquered this harsh environment. We're distinct from the red rock."
And completing that temple, combined with Brigham Young deciding to build a winter home there to help his arthritis, really signaled the town's importance. It proves St. George wasn't just some failed cotton outpost. It was the winter capital of their territory.
Which segues perfectly into the modern transformation of the city. Because despite that early importance, for a very long time, St. George remained a pretty isolated agricultural town. To get there from the north, you had to drive the old Highway 91, known as the Arrowhead Trail. And that was a slow, dangerous, winding nightmare of a road.
So the shift from isolation to connection in the modern era is really a story about massive engineering and infrastructure, specifically the construction of Interstate 15 and the Virgin River Gorge Project.
The Gorge Project revolutionized accessibility for the entire region. Before they blasted I-15 through that tiny corner of Arizona, St. George was effectively cut off from easy travel to the south. Cutting that highway straight through the twisting canyon of the Virgin River was one of the most expensive and technically difficult rural highway projects in U.S. history.
But the payoff was enormous. When it fully opened in 1973, it completely changed the physics and economics of the town. Suddenly, St. George is less than 2 hours from Las Vegas. It's seamlessly connected to the massive population centers of the California coast.
Connectivity originally killed their cotton industry back in 1869, but a century later, modern connectivity birthed their booming tourism and retirement industries. The establishment of SkyWest Airlines in 1972, right in St. George, also played a massive role in connecting them to major national hubs.
And you can see the results instantly in the demographics. The population graph just goes completely vertical at this point.
It really does. In 1950, you have roughly 4,500 people living there. Fast forward to today, and you're pushing over 95,000 in the city limits alone.
And as the population exploded, the entire identity of the town completely flipped. It transitioned away from this hardscrabble agricultural survivalism into the Sun City model.
The active aging economy. You saw developments like the Bloomington Country Club and Sun River pop up. Retirees began flocking there, obviously for the warm winter weather, but not just to sit around. This is where the extreme landscape actually becomes an economic asset again.
Because the exact same jagged canyons and volatile terrain that made traditional farming nearly impossible make for absolutely incredible outdoor recreation.
Exactly. And a prime example of this new economy is the Huntsman World Senior Games.
Right, founded in 1987.
Yes. It started small, but it is now the largest annual multi-sport event in the entire world, specifically for athletes aged 50 and over. We're talking about roughly 11,000 athletes from over 90 different countries descending on this little desert town every October.
And then you add in the extreme endurance sports. St. George has developed a serious reputation on the global triathlon circuit.
It's known as an absolute beast of a course. The intense heat, the massive red hills you have to climb on the bike, the relentless wind. The Ironman St. George and the St. George Marathon utilize the terrain to test human limits. They essentially commodify the difficulty of the landscape.
That is such a great way to put it.
The sheer physical resilience that was required just to live there and grow a potato in 1860 is now the exact same resilience required to race a triathlon there in 2024. It's the exact same human energy, just repurposed for modern leisure and competition.
It's fascinating how the local institutions have had to rebrand themselves to keep up with this massive cultural shift, too. The local university is a perfect case study. It has had quite the journey with its name over the decades.
That name change is a fascinating microcosm of the region's broader evolution. It originally started as Dixie Academy, then it became Dixie Normal College, then Dixie State. For generations, the name Dixie was fiercely defended as a way to honor that original pioneer cotton mission we talked about.
But as St. George grew into a global destination in the 21st century, that name carried heavy national baggage.
It did. The association with the American South, the Confederacy, and the racial connotations simply didn't align with the goals of a modern, forward-looking global institution.
So in 2022, they make a massive pivot.
Right, they officially became Utah Tech University.
Which is a huge statement of intent for the whole region.
It absolutely is. It's the community saying, we are no longer just looking back at our agricultural pioneer past. We are actively looking forward to a polytechnic technological mission. It is a deliberate attempt to redefine the region's core identity from a heritage farming town to a modern innovation hub.
So if we take a step back and look at this entire historical timeline we've covered today, going all the way from the Anasazi room blocks to the Mormon cotton fields to the modern Ironman finish line, what is the ultimate takeaway here?
I think the real synthesis of all these sources is about the constant interplay between harsh geography and human ingenuity. The history here is defined entirely by adapting to volatility, and the geography itself hasn't actually changed. It is still a harsh convergence of three hostile deserts. The river is still highly prone to devastating flash floods.
Right, like the massive flood in 2005 that took out 28 homes and caused around $200 million in damage.
Exactly. And compare that to the 2010 flood, where their modern mitigation efforts and heavily armored riverbanks actually held up. The natural constraints and threats remain exactly the same as they were 1,000 years ago.
But the human adaptation constantly evolves.
Precisely. The Anasazi adapted with brilliant ancient hydroengineering. The Paiute adapted with mobility and a dual economy. The pioneers adapted with sheer stubbornness, a cannon, and industrial experimentation. And the modern city adapts with massive reservoirs, global connectivity, and a service economy. They shifted from merely surviving the desert to actively thriving in it.
It really is a masterclass in human resilience. St. George is a perfect case study in how geography dictates your destiny, but human ingenuity allows you to rewrite the script. But looking at the explosive population growth today, it does leave me wondering about the future.
That is the big looming question for the entire Southwest, isn't it? We are seeing unprecedented growth, but the water source, the Virgin River Basin, is the exact same finite, volatile ribbon of green that the Anasazi depended on all those centuries ago. And remember, the Anasazi eventually hit an environmental tipping point where their adaptations failed and they had to leave.
So the real question for you to ponder is this. Is our modern engineering, our Utah Tech mindset, and our armored concrete riverbanks genuinely robust enough to handle these severe environmental pressures of the next century? Or are we ultimately just as vulnerable to the desert as the ancient civilizations were, just with better air conditioning?
That is a fantastic provocation. Are we truly defying the desert permanently, or are we just borrowing time from it?
Something to really mull over the next time you find yourself driving past those towering red rocks. Look for the old mulberry trees downtown. Look up at the blinding white temple against the cliffs. And remember the Mexican-American war cannon buried deep in the mud beneath it. It is a wonderfully heavy, complex history for such a sunny, sprawling place.
It absolutely is.
Well, that's all we have for this deep dive into the St. George experiment. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.